July 10th, 1943. Syracuse Sector, Sicily, Italian Peninsula. The Mediterranean sun, a blinding, merciless orb, beat down on the freshly disturbed earth of Sicily. The air, heavy and humid, was a thick blend of scorched vegetation, seawater, and the metallic tang of explosives. Sergeant Thomas "Tommy" McPherson, a man whose hands were more accustomed to the cold steel of a plow than the hot barrel of a rifle, wiped a stream of sweat and dust from his brow. His uniform, already soaked, clung uncomfortably to his lean frame. Around him, the beachhead was a controlled chaos, ducks lumbering ashore, Sherman tanks grinding through the sand, and the constant, shouted commands of officers fighting to maintain order amid the logistical nightmare of Operation Husky. Tommy and his platoon, part of the Royal Canadian Regiment of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, had landed near Pacino, relatively unopposed compared to the American and British sectors. But the relative quiet only amplified the internal tension. Tommy, a farm boy from the wide-open prairies of Saskatchewan, felt the weight of expectation. For 4 long years, the Canadian Army had been training endlessly in the damp, muddy camps of southern England. They were the untested, the reserves, often feeling like supporting actors in a global drama. Now, their stage was a hostile, ancient island, and their audience was the world, including a deeply skeptical German high command. In the reinforced concrete bunkers, hundreds of miles away, the General Staff of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, held a contemptuous view of the entire Canadian effort. Their intelligence reports, meticulously cross-referenced with propaganda needs, consistently categorized the Canadian Army as colonial filler, TA. A captured internal memo, later confirmed by Allied intelligence, contained the stinging assessment: the Canadians are primarily comprised of farmers and lumberjacks, lacking the European military tradition, training and the necessary experience for sustained, high-intensity conflict. This sneering dismissal became an unspoken challenge for every Canadian soldier. They knew they were seen as green, as men whose primary battlefield skills lay in agriculture, not armor. The propaganda mocked their diversity, their perceived lack of discipline, contrasting them sharply with the veteran Africa Corps divisions now regrouping in Italy. Major General Guy Simons, the sharp, demanding commander of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, understood this perception and used it to hone his force into a highly professional, if unconventional, fighting machine. Simons emphasized innovation, speed, and aggression, qualities he believed lay dormant in his pragmatic, determined troops. He didn't want flashy history. He wanted results. And in the oppressive, unforgiving terrain of Sicily, results were quickly demanded. Tommy's platoon was immediately pushed inland. The goal was to secure Syracuse, a major port city vital for maintaining the Allied supply lines. The terrain quickly morphed into a punishing landscape of jagged volcanic hills, narrow, winding roads choked with dust, and treacherous olive groves where German machine gunners could easily conceal themselves. The first days of fighting were a brutal baptism. Near the town of Gramichel, the Canadians encountered elements of the veteran Hermann Göring Panzer Division. This was no skirmish. It was a head-on clash against hardened German professionals. The Canadians advanced methodically, utilizing their excellent training in small unit tactics. Their artillery support, commanded by Brigadier H.G.D. Crira, was devastatingly accurate, silencing German gun positions with precision fire they had perfected over years of drill. Tommy's squad found themselves clearing a farmhouse complex, house to house, room to room. The fighting was close, visceral, and terrifyingly fast. He saw a comrade fall, hit by a burst of fire from an MP-40 submachine gun, and felt a wave of icy resolve wash over his fear. He emptied a clip from his Lee Enfield, the heavy bolt action a familiar, comforting motion. Driving back the entrenched German infantry, they pushed past strong resistance at Mota Santa Anastasia, where the Germans had positioned heavy machine guns to dominate the narrow valley leading to Catania. It was here that the perceived farmer tenacity paid dividends. Unlike the rapid, sometimes overly aggressive advances of other units, the Canadians demonstrated a relentless, grinding persistence. They moved cautiously, clearing every fold in the ground, every patch of scrub, neutralizing the enemy's strong points without unnecessary sacrifice. Within days, the speed and competence of the Canadian advance began to turn heads within the Allied command. They captured Agira, a heavily fortified hilltop town, in a fierce, costly battle that lasted nearly 5 days against determined German paratroopers. They did not retreat. They did not panic. They used their heavy 25-pounder field guns to systematically reduce the German defenses before assaulting the shattered positions. Word filtered back to the German lines. These were not the raw recruits their propaganda promised. These Canadians were disciplined, highly motivated, and, most surprisingly to the OKW, possessed an incredibly effective artillery arm. The sneering dismissal began to be replaced by a cautious respect, tinged with disbelief. The Canadians had taken their first major objective, Syracuse, securing a critical piece of the Allied logistical puzzle. And they were advancing up the Italian mainland with surprising velocity. But Sicily was just the prologue. The true test of their untested status, a challenge against Hitler's most formidable defenses, was waiting on the blood-soaked mainland. The Canadians were about to enter the most brutal phase of the Italian campaign, where the German scorn would turn into desperate fear. October 1943, the Adriatic coast, eastern Italy. The Italian mainland was a different beast entirely from Sicily. It was a land of brutal mountains, torrential autumn rains, and a defensive genius named Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of the German forces in Italy. Kesselring recognized the strategic importance of denying the Allies easy movement and began constructing a series of interlocking, heavily fortified defensive belts designed to bleed the Allied advance dry. The Canadian Corps, now firmly established on the eastern flank, were moving up the Adriatic coast, a path that should have been easier than the mountainous spine of the country. But Kesselring had turned it into a quagmire. The ground was sodden, the ancient stone villages were transformed into concrete strongholds, and every river crossing was a death trap. Sergeant McPherson, now a veteran of the Sicilian campaign, felt the shift in the nature of the fighting. The quick, aggressive maneuvers of Sicily were replaced by a cold, grinding war of attrition. His unit, still with the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, found themselves battling not just the Germans, but the elements themselves. The famous Italian sun had given way to persistent, cold rain, turning the roads into thick, gluey mud that immobilized their universal carriers and bogged down the Sherman tanks. The German High Command's scorn, though diminished by the Canadian performance in Sicily, was still a factor. German commanders had been ordered to give ground slowly, forcing the Allies to expend resources and lives for every kilometer. They believed the Canadians, being relatively new to this kind of sustained, heavy combat, would break under the strain. Their assessment was put to the ultimate test at the Sangro River, a crossing point that Kesselring had turned into a masterpiece of defensive engineering. The river itself, swollen by the autumn downpours, was a raging torrent. On the north bank, the Germans of the 76th Panzer Corps had established machine gun nests, mortar positions, and artillery observation posts with a perfect, deadly view of the approaching Canadians. Every single approach route was mined and covered by interlocking fields of fire. The Canadian offensive began in late November 1943. It was pure hell. Engineers worked under relentless German shell fire, their efforts hampered by the thick, freezing mud. Bridging the Sangro was an engineering nightmare. Tommy McPherson's regiment was among the first infantry units ordered across. The objective was to establish a bridgehead and clear the immediate German positions, allowing follow-on forces to consolidate the crossing. The fighting was savage. As they waded through the near-freezing water, they faced a storm of fire. The Canadians didn't have the vast numerical superiority of the Soviets on the Eastern Front, nor the continuous aerial dominance the British and Americans would later enjoy in France. They relied on their discipline, their sheer tenacity, and the power of their concentrated 25-pounder artillery, which proved capable of shattering German fortified positions even in these treacherous conditions. Tommy and his platoon spent 72 agonizing hours pinned down in muddy trenches, enduring repeated German counterattacks. They fought the elite 1st Parachute Division, arguably some of the toughest, most dedicated soldiers in the Wehrmacht. The battle was a test of wills. The German paratroopers were professional killers. The Canadians were farmers and lumberjacks who simply refused to yield ground they had won at such cost. The Canadians held. They stabilized the bridgehead, pushing the German defenders back from the riverbank and securing the crossing. The cost was terrible, but the result was undeniable. The 1st Canadian Corps had cracked one of Kesselring's main defensive lines, a significant victory that forced the German commander to realize he was dealing with a force of unexpected quality and fortitude. The successful crossing of the Sangro was the turning point in the German High Command's perception. The dismissive tone vanished from their battle assessments. The farmers had proven they could fight and win a sustained, defensive shattering battle against elite forces in the most miserable conditions imaginable. The Canadians had earned their bloody stripes. Now, they were pointed toward the next, most formidable challenge, the impregnable defenses of the Gustav Line, and a destiny that would lead them directly toward the coveted prize of Rome. May 1944. The Liri Valley, central Italy. The Gustav Line, Kesselring's masterpiece, stretched across the Italian peninsula like a jagged scar. Anchored by the formidable heights of Monte Cassino, it had held the bulk of the Allied armies, including the Americans, British, and French, for months, inflicting horrific losses. After the brutal, prolonged battles around Cassino, the Germans retreated slightly to a secondary, equally formidable position, the Senger Line, which the Allies quickly, and more fittingly, renamed the Hitler Line. This line, running through the fertile but deadly Liri Valley, was the final, devastating barrier before the Allied forces could break out into the open plains leading to Rome. The German High Command was confident this line would hold indefinitely, boasting that it was impenetrable. They had learned their lesson at the Sangro. The Canadians were tough, but the sheer scale of the Hitler Line would surely crush their aggression. The Canadian Corps, having been transferred from the Adriatic to the Liri Valley to participate in the massive Operation Diadem, were tasked with delivering the main blow against the strongest point of the Hitler Line, centered around the town of Pontecorvo and the village of Muro. The objective was clear: smash the line open and exploit the breach to allow the British 8th Army to pour into the valley. For Sergeant McPherson and the men of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, this meant facing an almost insurmountable landscape of fortified concrete emplacements, deep anti-tank ditches, massive coils of concertina wire, and a killing zone covered by heavy mortar and machine gun fire from the German 1st Parachute Division and the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division. The attack was scheduled for May 23, 1944. The air was charged with nervous energy and the low rumble of over 1,000 Allied guns preparing for the bombardment. The Canadian plan relied on two crucial elements: unparalleled artillery support and a lightning-fast breach using heavily protected Churchill tanks equipped with specialized engineer equipment. At 6 a.m., the ground erupted. The pre-attack artillery barrage, a stunning concentration of firepower primarily directed by Canadian commanders, hammered the German forward positions. The ground shook violently for hours. But as the barrage lifted and the infantry began to move, the Germans, deeply entrenched in their concrete pillboxes, emerged to deliver a withering, coordinated fire. The key defensive sector that McPherson's regiment faced was a seemingly innocuous area near a small, winding stream. However, it was layered with thick minefields and covered by interlocking fire from concealed MG-42 positions. The casualties mounted quickly. The momentum of the advance threatened to stall, exactly as Kesselring had planned. The Canadian response, forged in the mud of the Sangro, was not to retreat, but to adapt with brutal efficiency. Specialized Wasp flamethrower carriers, universal carriers mounted with flamethrowers, were brought up, their jets of fire silencing stubborn pillboxes that resisted conventional artillery. Infantry, often led by veteran NCOs like McPherson, pressed forward using smoke to mask their movements, crawling through the wire and utilizing Bangalore torpedoes to clear paths through the mines. McPherson himself was part of a squad tasked with neutralizing a persistent German sniper position that was decimating a forward platoon. The position was a well-concealed stone shed on a slight rise. Instead of waiting for heavy support, McPherson and two other corporals circled wide, traversing a shallow, muddy vineyard. They approached the shed from the blind side, rushing the position under a hail of enemy fire from secondary posts. The fight was quick and savage, ending with the Canadians using grenades and bayonets to eliminate the threat. The overall battle for the Hitler line was a masterpiece of combined arms warfare, a demonstration of the Canadian Corps' maturation, unlike earlier, more hesitant attempts by other Allied units on similar German lines. The Canadians were relentless. Their engineers performed miracles under fire, breaching the main anti-tank ditch with fascines and earth-moving equipment, allowing the 5th Canadian Armoured Division to punch through. By the evening of May 24th, after 36 hours of continuous, brutal combat, the impossible had happened. The German High Command's impenetrable Hitler line was shattered. The Canadian Corps had blown a massive hole in the strongest defensive position in Italy, paving the way for the breakout. This victory was recognized instantly by Allied generals as the crucial blow that finally destabilized the entire German front south of Rome. The farmers had not only fought the veterans, they had decisively beaten them. The road to Rome was now open, and the Canadians, having drawn immense German attention and broken their last major defensive belt, were poised to play an unanticipated, decisive role in the city's liberation. Late May 1944, the Liri Valley to Valmontone. The breaking of the Hitler line unleashed a torrent of movement that the German command had not anticipated. Kesselring, despite his genius, had staked everything on the line holding. Now, with the Canadian breach creating a gaping wound in his defenses, he was forced into a desperate, chaotic retreat toward Rome. The goal for the Allies was simple: exploit the opening, destroy the retreating German 10th Army, and capture the Eternal City before Kesselring could establish another stabilized line. The Canadian Corps, still leading the thrust on the Central Axis, were now fighting a different kind of war, a swift, mobile pursuit. For Sergeant McPherson and his company, the constant, grueling trench warfare was replaced by rapid advances, brief but intense skirmishes, and the exhilaration of seeing the enemy in full disarray. Their Sherman tanks, finally free from the mud, roared down the main roads, meeting pockets of fierce but disorganized German resistance. The most critical and unexpected development occurred to the west, While the Canadians were battling their way past the shattered remnants of the German defenses toward the towns of Frosinone and Valmontone, the American Fifth Army, commanded by General Mark Clark, was also driving north from their recently secured Anzio beachhead. General Clark had a singular, overriding ambition to be the first Allied commander to enter and liberate Rome. It was a matter of immense prestige, both military and national. The initial plan for Operation Diadem had called for the main thrust, including the Canadians, to cut off and destroy the German 10th Army near Valmontone, east of Rome. However, Clark, sensing the opportunity, executed a controversial and critical deviation. He abruptly shifted the bulk of the American thrust away from Valmontone and the retreating German forces, directing his divisions straight toward Rome itself. This decision, driven by the desire for glory, had immense consequences. It allowed large numbers of German forces to escape the planned encirclement, prolonging the war in Italy. But paradoxically, it increased the operational importance of the Canadian advance. The Canadian Corps, pushing relentlessly northwest, suddenly found themselves in the role of both pursuers and flank protectors. They engaged the stubborn German rearguards, determined to slow the Canadian drive toward Paliano and Pofi. The fighting, though less geographically fixed than the Hitler Line, was brutal. Every hill, every stone bridge, was contested by dedicated German units covering their main forces' retreat. Sergeant McPherson's platoon found themselves clearing snipers and anti-tank positions in a series of scorched earth villages. They moved fast, often relying on their own initiative, utilizing the lessons of aggression and resilience they had forged in Sicily and the Sangro. They were no longer the untested farmers. They were hardened infantry, expertly supported by their own artillery and armor. The German High Command, now fully aware of the threat posed by the Canadians, poured whatever reserves they had into slowing their advance. Radio intercepts showed a new, desperate respect in their reports. The Canadian Corps is advancing with a dangerous speed, displaying exceptional endurance. All efforts must be made to hold the Valmontone sector to prevent the complete collapse of the Italian defense. The Canadian push toward Valmontone succeeded in drawing and fixing several key German divisions, preventing them from reinforcing the road to Rome. The tenacious pursuit by the Canadian Corps was the necessary bloody shield that protected General Clark's flank as he raced for the city gates. The original plan had failed due to Clark's diversion, but the sheer, unstoppable momentum of the Canadian advance ensured that the German 10th Army could never fully reorganize or counterattack. As June 1944 dawned, the Canadian troops found themselves just southeast of Rome, having performed the decisive tactical breakthrough at the Hitler Line and then executing a relentless pursuit operation. While the Americans were taking the glory of the entrance, it was the Canadian blood spilled in the Liri Valley and the final, brutal push toward Valmontone that had destroyed the defensive system and cleared the path for the Allied march on the Eternal City. June 4th, 1944, Valmontone, just southeast of Rome. The final days leading up to the liberation of Rome were a blur of action and exhaustion for Sergeant Thomas McPherson. His platoon was now positioned near Valmontone, a crucial bottleneck where the German forces were attempting to funnel their remaining troops north. The Canadian objective was not to take Rome itself, but to decisively hold the enemy in place, preventing any organized counterattack and ensuring the smooth, unmolested entry of the American forces into the undefended city. The irony was not lost on the Canadian soldiers. They had spearheaded the attack on the toughest defenses. The Hitler Line suffered the heavy losses and fought a brilliant mobile action to break Kesselring's operational coherence. Yet, the honor of being the first to drive tanks through the ancient gates of Rome belonged to the Americans. General Clark had achieved his primary goal of national prestige, but the Canadians, including Tommy McPherson, were focused on their mission. As the Americans entered the city, met with cheering crowds and clicking cameras, the Canadian Corps was still locked in bitter, essential combat. McPherson's regiment engaged the German rearguard in a fierce, rolling battle across the hills surrounding Valmontone. They encountered the German 362nd Infantry Division and elements of the 1st Parachute Division again, troops fighting not for victory, but for time, trying to keep their escape corridors open. In one particularly tense engagement, McPherson and his squad were ordered to silence a heavy German mortar position that was harassing the Canadian supply line. The position was located on a rocky outcrop, providing perfect observation. The approach was treacherous, demanding a silent, uphill climb under the cover of thick morning fog. It was a mission that demanded the inherent resourcefulness of the farmers and lumberjacks. They used every skill learned in the Canadian wilderness, tracking, stealth, and rugged endurance, to get within striking distance. They achieved a complete surprise. The ensuing close quarters fight was swift and decisive. The Canadians, though often mocked for their supposed lack of sophistication, displayed a lethal combination of disciplined firepower and individual initiative. They neutralized the position, capturing the German crew and securing the critical crossroads below. On the afternoon of June 4th, 1944, as the world's headlines screamed of the liberation of Rome by American forces, the Canadian Corps finalized its grueling task, having pinned down and decimated the last major elements of the German 10th Army south of the city. The operational reality was clear. The Americans entered Rome because the Canadians had shattered the Hitler line and held the German retreat at Valmontone. This victory came at a staggering price. By the end of the Italian campaign, the Canadian Corps would suffer over 26,000 casualties, with nearly 6,000 dead. They had proven, beyond any shadow of doubt, that the scornful dismissal by the German High Command that they were merely farmers and raw recruits was dangerously, tragically wrong. The colonial troops had fought some of the toughest, most veteran German divisions in the most physically demanding environment of the war, and had emerged victorious. The true Canadian achievement was often overshadowed by the high-profile American entry into Rome. Just 2 days later, the attention of the world shifted entirely to Normandy and D-Day, forever cementing the Italian campaign as the forgotten front. Yet, the legacy of the Canadian effort in Italy remains unshakable. They transformed from an untested expeditionary force into one of the most reliable, disciplined, and formidable corps in the Allied Army. Tommy McPherson, the Saskatchewan farm boy, survived the brutal trek, carrying with him the silent knowledge that he and his comrades had, through sheer grit and sacrifice, delivered the decisive blow that finally opened the gates of the Eternal City. Their valor, honed in the mud of the Sangro and the inferno of the Leary Valley, proved that the spirit of the Canadian soldier was forged not in tradition, but in relentless, quiet resolve.